This week we're talking to Trevor Bryant, who is the Senior Information Security Architect at Epigen. Is that how you pronounce it?
Epigen.
Epigen Technology. Trevor is here with us in studio to talk about risk management, particularly the risk management framework. I don't know who puts that out. And how to leverage sound business practices to promote security and compliance initiatives in the workplace. We're devoting both segments today to our discussion, so join us as we tear down silos and build bridges on Security and Compliance Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production. And now, it's the show that bridges the requirements of regulations, compliance, and privacy with those of security. Your trusted source for complying with various mandates, building effective programs, and current compliance news. It's time for Security and Compliance Weekly. Today's organizations face an evolving set of security threats and continually changing compliance requirements. As your business grows, privacy concerns only multiply and add to a dynamic set of priorities. Today's organizations need to integrate risk, security, and privacy into a cohesive program. Online Business Systems team of seasoned security practitioners work closely with you to assess your security posture, policies, procedures, and technologies, providing tailored solutions that are specifically aligned to your business's risk profile and ultimately ensure the protection of your brand. To learn more about Online Business Systems, go to securityweekly.com/online.
And welcome to episode number 14 of Security and Compliance Weekly, recorded January 21st, 2020. I'm your host, Mr. Jeff Mann, coming to you from quite chilly Rhode Island at G Unit Studios. And did I mention it's cold up here? Actually, it's not that bad. Joining me remotely today are my esteemed co-hosts, Mr. Matt Alderman, Mr. Scott Lyons, and Mr. Josh Marpet, all of whom we have just determined are executives in their respective organizations. Welcome, gentlemen.
Them is almost fighting words, Jeff.
Almost.
Hey,
It's warmer in Colorado today than it is in Rhode Island.
I wondered about that. We should all be in Colorado. One quick announcement before we get the ball rolling. Join us at InfoSec World 2020, which is March 30th through April 1st at the Disney Contemporary Resort. Security Weekly listeners save 15% off the InfoSec World main conference or World Pass. Visit securityweekly.com/ISW. We have a Govey here today, so I'll say India Sierra Whiskey 2020. Click the registration button to register with our discount code. All right. So in studio today, we have Mr. Trevor Bryant. Trevor is, what is your exact title? I know it's long and fancy. Senior Information Security Architect at Epigen Technology. Welcome, Trevor.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. For the record, I am not the Fed that's here.
That's true.
So we're not playing Spot the Fed, Trevor.
No, we're not.
Not right now.
There is a Fed in the house, but we'll save that interview for another day. I've known Trevor for several years now. We're both from the D.C., Maryland, Virginia area. We often see each other at various hacker meetups and conferences in the D.C. area.
That's right.
And when this show first started, we have our own Slack channel with our DC meetup community, and Trevor, do you still have it up? You could read it to me. But he mentioned that he was excited that this show was starting out because it was...
This show specializes a lot more in the domains that we work in.
And I thought, gee, if he's somebody that likes to talk about compliance, I should get him on the show sometime. So here you are.
Thank you.
So we're going to talk about risk management, but to start off, Trevor, just tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do, your day job, and what your interests are.
Sure. I'm the, as you mentioned, Senior Information Security Architect at a company called Epigen Technology. In my current capacity, I work a lot with the C-level staff, as we established before going live here.
Right.
Help them apply effective programs, stick to their mission statements, their objectives, and I do a lot of translating the tech policy that comes out today into an actual technical implementation to develop an effective strategy for their security programs, their risk management programs. There's a privacy framework that just came out, so that's going to be more weekend homework.
Right. Some people have probably already read it and memorized it.
I bet the
That
people
we know.
that drafted it have already read it and memorized it.
Well, those two. I know we've had conversations off and on in the various times that we meet up, and I think we're more or less in alignment in terms of compliance being something that is necessary to help a lot of companies move forward or sort of get their arms around any semblance of how do we know if we're doing security well or right. But a question we like to ask all of our guests is, when you think of security and compliance, where do you kind of fall in your way of thinking on the continuum, if you will, of security versus compliance?
I am definitely on the compliance side, and that's because, and something I emphasize, is that the security teams, the security program exists to protect the business, and that's where a lot of the compliance comes in. Compliance isn't just combating with security, it's working with the acquisitions team, the finance team, the general counsel team. All of these, the compliance program goes together to complement and support all of those various teams to help protect the business.
Interesting. Gentlemen, any questions initially for Trevor?
You have a fascinating take on compliance, and I like that. That's good. I really enjoy that. And a lot of people that we've talked to have said, well, you can be secure, you can be compliant, but one has nothing to do with the other. And compliance is a subset of security. I think I offended Wendy Nather when I told her she was wrong. It's it's a very different world for a lot of people. They're so used to coming up from security, and compliance is something that bothers me. Go away, go away, go away. Just check the box and leave me alone. And you're like, no, I'm on the compliance side. I deal with so many different departments. Security is just one of them. I like that. I just wanted to point that out. Well done.
Yeah, thank you. How would you know how the maturity level of your security programs without some of those checkbox and balances?
The checkbox and balances.
Hey, we're asking the questions here.
You could, but you could. Look, you can measure maturity without being under a compliance mandate.
True.
You can.
But who does?
Well, I think that's probably true, Jeff, right? That not a lot of people do, but you can. If you definitely want to understand how to build a security program and do it, compliance doesn't have to be a requirement to do it, right? You have to make that decision yourself, and then you can build a program. You can measure yourself from a maturity perspective. You don't need compliance to do that. So, what I think, Trevor, I like more is when you think about compliance more holistically, you think about risk more holistically. It is more than just security. I used to run the third-party vendor management program for one of the large national banks. That's how I got into compliance. It was procurement and finance and all these different pieces. Security was one of the pieces we addressed as part of that overall third-party management program. And so you're right. It is broader than security. And so for organizations that have a compliance mandate or mandates and are truly looking to do risk management, it is much more holistic, or it should be more holistic than just security.
Right. And to complement on top of that, the way I see compliance when you're going and doing those checkboxes and balances is you're assessing the organization based on the risk of its current processes, and what comes out of that is generally metrics. And if you're going to go and justify requesting for more budget or more resources, you're going to need those metrics developed.
Yeah, metrics is a very interesting problem, right? Because when I was at Tenable, we used to talk. I used to do a talk on metrics. It's not easy for people to actually build metrics, I think, or at least metrics that make sense in a way to align back to goals, objectives, and risk. And so I think that's something we might want to dig into a little bit, Trevor, while we have you today, is how do you build some of those metrics, and what are the appropriate types of metrics? Because I still think a lot of people struggle with that. That's an appropriate topic or lead in to talk about Epigen itself. What does Epigen do, and then what do you do there?
So with Epigen, we work a lot with the federal customers, some local, state, and getting into defense, or we might already be.
So you're not a Fed, but your customers very often are Feds.
Yes.
Okay. So you're playing in the Fed space.
That's the only space I've professionally been in, so it's really what I can speak to.
Okay.
So as Epigen, a lot of our priorities are supporting the customers, the mission objectives, the people, the culture, supporting the business, working with contract phrasing or contract refinements, and as Matt supported the financial objectives. Typically, the leadership that we work with end up becoming the leads in their respective areas and the advocates for the technologies that they're championing or actually changing. One of the things that we like to say a lot is, if you don't know where you're going, any path will lead you there. And so we typically help with
That's
the
almost a
strategy on how to
really
get there.
deep statement right there.
We're deep people.
One of the things I was curious about, because I know you've had previous jobs in the time I've known you, and I think you've, as you said, you've always worked in the Fed space. Something I'm curious about, and I'm not sure that you can answer it directly. Maybe we can discuss it, but I'm curious as to how the world is different when you're a federal government or state government organization and you have to meet compliance standards. How's that different in terms of my experience, which is much more the private sector and companies that are outside of the government? The only way I can think of to do that, given that you can't make the comparison in your head because you don't have the other experience, is
Right.
what is a day in the life of an entity that you're working with, and a customer, and maybe what's a typical compliance standard or framework that they have to work with. We mentioned the risk management framework. We'll get to that. Maybe we'll talk about this now. Maybe we'll bring risk up when it's appropriate, I guess. But what's the process look like? What are the drivers? What are the things that go into it, and with what you do and what you see your customers needing to do?
Sure. In the day-to-day, generally all conversations come down to risk at the end. If I do this, have I identified the risk? Have I identified what risks are going to be generated from this action or activity? If I don't do this, have I identified the risk, and do I know what's going to be generated from there?
Mm-hmm.
And so which avenue is going to benefit the business? What may hurt the business? What am I equipped with resource-wise to help protect the business based on those risk decisions?
What type of risks are your customers typically dealing with?
Oh my gosh, it could be anywhere between this contract got turned around, we were sequestered, we didn't receive the budget or the size of the budget that we requested, we have an executive order that just came out, or we have a binding operational directive from DHS and we need to change our direction of focus on this immediately.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of it comes down to no ifs, ands, or buts. We need to focus on an answer and a strategy sooner than later, if not now.
So what then is the risk if they don't make all that happen? Is it do they get fined? Do they lose more budget in the future?
I'd imagine there's some sort of fine or perhaps a subtle slap on the wrist. I don't have experience on the legal side, so I can't really speak to what happens from there. Generally, what I work on is the preparation of the portfolio and decision of what gets passed on to a side of the spectrum I don't generally see.
Gotcha.
You just get pulled in front of Congress and you have to have a hearing and, answer a bunch of crazy questions, right?
I really
Nothing
hope I
big.
don't have to do that.
Trevor, this is Scott. I got a question for you. You just said something really interesting. Roll the tape back about 10, 15 seconds. Binding operational. Can you explain what that is real quick?
Yeah, so there will be initiatives that come out of OMB, Office Management and Budget, and they will task Department of Homeland Security to come up with a plan, strategy, and work with the federal agencies or local state on a certain requirement that's come out. One of my favorite ones was, at the time it was OMB 1513. Not sure if that's been changed or upgraded to something else, but it was external-facing websites must meet the web certificate must meet a level of compliance for hyper-strict text protocol, HSTS. So
yeah. That was a while ago. Yeah.
Yeah, and that, is a lot more challenging than it may seem. It requires a lot of resources, budget. A lot of agencies, a very large sector of the federal government, have not met that objective yet. Fortunately for me and the team that I worked on, we were able to get at least 90% there in the agency that we supported.
So going back, thank you for the explanation. Going back to where you fall with security versus compliance, right? Would you find that in government situations, compliance is more of a team communication enhancement tool, or is it a yes, we're being secure tool?
It's going to come down to the culture of the current environment. It can be a tool for communication, effective communication, and working together, or it could be sort of closer to the toxic end where teams are already well established that they do not want to work together, and a compliance requirement is the blocker that we've come to discuss quite a bit.
So that's interesting, right? Because we've had discussion about blockers, and I think it was the last Security and Compliance Weekly episode. We were talking about blockers and how detrimental they are to progress within teams, right? As far as compliance goes with blockers inside of the government, what has been your experience with not only identifying them, right, but how to control them?
So when I first started working professionally, and I mean, like, whoa, what's 401k? Do I have to learn what this is? I was an auditor, not quite a security controls assessor, but an auditor at the time, and I quickly realized in this environment, people that were in my role were really the blockers. It came down to effective communication. So how I was able to manage around that was when I'd go to a meeting, meet with the system owners, like, hey, I need to do my job and review your system and your processes to make risk management recommendations. I was like, well, these first few meetings aren't going too well. So let me start off saying, I'm not the IRS. I don't control your budget. I'm not here for the budget. But let me tell you who I am, what I need to do, and how you can help me. And if we can get by that, let's talk about how I can help you.
I love the if we can get by that. I love the if we can get through just the introductions, we can possibly be productive if we're lucky.
Those are a lot nicer conversations. Sometimes you just have to get to, like, look, we're not here to be friends. We're here to be professional. If I can't manage your risk effectively, then you become part of that risk, and I have to report that.
Yeah, it occurs to me, I want to ask a more foundational question, because I don't know that I know the answer to it, so it's really a question. I and most of the hosts, I think, we do a fair amount of work in the commercial world, and we're somewhat familiar with organizational structures. We're talking about teams. I'm curious, what is the organizational structure of a typical, if there is such a thing, a typical federal organization look like, especially in terms of the security team, people that are responsible for security? Where do they fall in the organization? What does the organizational structure look like? I'm just curious as to whether it's similar or markedly different from it is in the commercial world.
I'd like to think it's similar, but I'm not entirely sure. A really good environment that I worked in at a fairly large agency, it was you had the undersecretary, then in the IT shop you had the CIO, then the CIO had his or her portfolio managers, and underneath those portfolio managers you had the projects or the programs to make those changes, initiatives, modernize. And in that particular organization, the security team was one security team. They had their ISSOs, ISSM equivalents, they had their security controls assessors, and they had their SOC people, and they all reported to the CISO and the structure within there. But then there was another organization I worked in, a very, very large organization, where they were so big they had little fiefdoms of security teams, and they had fiefdoms of operations teams and different teams of program managers. And so I'd consider that more chaotic. It was very difficult to actually get everybody seated at the table.
So in the commercial world, we typically talk about organizations having silos. So I'm assuming that roughly equates to what
The
you're
fiefdoms.
describing as a fiefdom. What are the fiefdoms to which you're referencing? What are they built up around typically?
I would like to know the answer to that question as well.
Okay.
Well, I mean, does each fiefdom surround a project or set of projects? Does each fiefdom surround a function or set of functions, shared service? Or is that just random?
A lot of them that I'm aware of come out of a direct need. So something happened, we need this team, or we need to stand something up, and here's their roles and responsibilities, and then here's your budget, and go forth. But then that may interact or overlap with an existing security team that has a very similar job, or they're forced to work together, and there might be pre-existing abrasive
Complications.
Interesting.
So
And once you spin up a fiefdom in the federal government, it doesn't go away, does it? It just stays there forever.
sure.
Perhaps. As long as they can justify their budget and keep it going, I
Right.
guess.
As long as they stay budgeted.
Also out of curiosity, you've used the term several times now, security controls assessor.
Yes.
What is that?
So with compliance, we have frameworks, the risk management framework, or there might be the cybersecurity framework, and now the privacy framework. But underneath the risk management framework, there is kind of the Bible of all the details of the security controls, and selecting these controls helps determine how effective the organization is going to be in various tiers. Organizational enterprise level, mission business level, and the actual system level. So a security controls assessor is going to, whether they have a targeted assessment or just kind of like a wide scope assessment, they will select various controls, or they might be pre-selected for them, and go and assess how the business processes are and the maturity level, and if those business processes present any risk to the organization.
So to some degree, they might be responsible for determining what's in scope or what's appropriate in terms of the controls themselves.
Yeah.
And then they go in and evaluate or assess how well the organization is meeting those controls.
How effective is your change management program? How effective is your turnaround time on security incidents, or incidents in general? Do those incidents generate a problem incident, and what's the triage time? Or who has access to the system? Is there any risk to the system if there's too much access?
And then,
So in the commercial world, that would be kind of like an audit, right?
and
Similar?
that's what I'm wondering, because I mean that kind of sounds like what most of us in the commercial world would define the role as an auditor to be. So in the context of your job and your exposure, what then is an auditor? You said you started as an auditor. What in your context is an auditor?
Well, the 4-letter definition from the organization we agreed to not mention, the one that generated the risk management framework, they define audit as a validation of the data that's generated from whatever. And then an assessment is a review of the processes of the business.
So is one considered to be quantitative and one qualitative? One's more,
I guess that's the way to
more
look
of a
at
deeper
it.
dive?
Like an auditor would review the books, the ledger, is there any fraud, waste, abuse happening internally? An assessor is going to go and review the processes that generate that ledger or the books.
Is the auditor, the way you're describing it, looking at the data and making any judgment on whether the data is meaningful, relevant, meeting the requirement, or are they looking more for, there's data in this field, there's a report here, so you're good from that perspective?
I guess it could be one or multiple of those things. Generally, in my experience, it's to identify if the data has been manipulated.
Okay.
Which in cases I've actually discovered, and those are unpleasant conversations from a risk management perspective.
Interesting.
Hey, you're all screwed up. Let's really talk about it. Those are always fun.
Well, there's a lot of fear out there. There's a lot of organizational trauma, and if somebody has the opportunity to cook some books, then they may just do so.
Come on, tell a war story. You want to.
I once had a customer who wanted me to, who asked, individual that used too many words and I don't think really knew the definition of the words I were asking. So the sentences were very difficult to dissect. But once I was able to dissect them, I was like, wait a minute, you want me to manipulate my own audit reports to show that the organization is actually passing audits rather than we are under-resourced and unable to achieve our audit goals?
Interesting.
And they're like, well,
we wouldn't put it
kinda.
that way. We wouldn't put it that way. But if you can say we're doing okay, that would be great.
Well, it was interesting too because I was 22 and not understanding of people's feelings. So I actually said that in a meeting with their boss there.
Oh!
Wow. Millennial mistakes. They happen.
No. I've done the same thing, but I'm not a millennial, okay? I'm sorry. The gray hair, not millennial. And I've done it too. I've been like, so you want me to lie?
We were all 22 once.
Yeah.
Some of us.
Well, I mean, yeah, admittedly, but for Jeff, that was before computers were around. So.
Pretty much. Yeah, pretty much. Thanks for that, Josh.
I
Hey,
have
no
no
problem,
comment.
brother. No problem.
So this.
So
well,
go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Josh, please.
Well, I mean, so you've pointed out some interesting things, that the idea of audit and assessment, the idea of risk management is in a lot of ways very similar in government as it is to commercial. You've pointed out that the the standards that we all rely on from that 4-letter organization are effectively, I don't know if I can say universal. Is that a valid term, do you think?
Yeah, they removed a lot of the federal verbiage and wrote it in such a way that it complied to any organization, and that's including global or international organizations. Although, Jeff,
Okay.
perhaps for the viewers and listeners, would you like to share what this 4-letter word is? Or
No,
acronym?
I think we should just keep them guessing.
There are listen. There are more than enough companies that never institute security testing. Okay,
There's a lot of companies
really good,
these
Scott.
days.
I was trying to think of one, but that's really good.
There's a lot of companies these days that simply can't afford it.
Does this certain 4-letter agency also put out other frameworks?
They do. They put out the cybersecurity framework.
Oh, now I know who
the
we're
risk,
talking about.
the privacy framework that
That's brand new.
is currently in draft.
Right.
I think released a couple days ago.
Yeah, they just.
Maybe-
I
It
haven't-
released a couple days ago. I thought
Yeah,
it was
it's-
I thought it was another week.
No, I think it came out end of last week. I thought I heard the announcement or saw
A couple
something.
working days ago.
Couple working days ago. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm sure they put out more frameworks that are simply outside of my domain, and I look to other experts.
It's a little bit off topic, but I actually had a customer call a couple days ago, and I'm trying to help this company build up their vulnerability management program. They're sort of starting out. Not that they should have just been starting out, but the reality is a lot of companies don't have mature processes in place for things.
Say it ain't so.
Say it ain't so. And I was asking them, what's driving them, what are they using? They happen to be a Canadian company, and so I was asking what are your drivers, what are your regulatory frameworks, and they actually cited the cybersecurity framework as what they're modeling their vulnerability management program, which I thought was fascinating, given that they're not even American, they're not a U.S. entity, and because they are the first company that I've ever met in terms of as a customer that is actually using the cybersecurity framework as a model. I thought that was fascinating.
I think that's really cool. I personally have looked to other governments and organizations to see what their models are somewhere else in the world, but I run into the limitation of not knowing how to read that language.
right. And we commonly come across companies that haven't figured out A, that they need to deal with compliance, B, where the heck to start, and C, who really drives it, and push a lot of companies towards that framework as a starting point, right?
Great framework.
So, yeah, it's a really great framework, especially when you're in countries that are associated government-wise with the U.S., right?
Yeah, that makes
Five
sense.
Eyes, various others, yeah.
But those organizations that do know what these frameworks are, and even if they're not American companies or in the federal government, they it's still a benefit, I think, because they're able to achieve. They're able to what was the word? Strategize an effective program. They can identify what their assets are, protect what their assets are, or in the risk management framework, work in the preparation phase, which is just so much identification and then coming up with an effective plan, coming up with continuous monitoring. It's quite exhaustive, but they know what it is.
Right.
I've got a question for you. In using the risk management framework, the RMF, or the CSF, the cybersecurity framework, in the federal world, how long does it take to go through an iteration of that? I realize it's a constant iteration, but is it in the commercial world, a company that's starting from scratch can easily take a year to get through the cybersecurity framework and get to where they should be profiled to be? Do we see similar timeframes in federal gov?
The average that I've seen at any size is the first year is always the planning phase. The second year is, okay, let's identify the resources. Let's pick and choose what we can reasonably achieve. And then the third year is the implementation phase. Some organizations may be better, faster, stronger than others. Some are waiting on the experts to come in or trying to hire the experts to be able to actually come up with those programs and implementations.
I feel like we're going to have comments in rebuttal to that, but let's take a break real quick, and we'll come back and we'll focus more on the risk management framework and how long it should take.